actually.
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, so welcome everybody. Officially, my name is Ginny and I work for Anderson's Bookshop. And I'm so excited to have you with us tonight for these two fantastic authors who, if you missed it earlier, have knew each other but had never been together. So they're having this conversation sort of for the first time, which I can't wait to hear. I'm a huge historical fiction reader myself, and I can't wait to hear what you guys have to say. So I know that this is yet another screen to keep your eyes on tonight, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do that, to talk books with us. For those of you who aren't familiar, Anderson's is an independent bookstore, which for us means we've been owned and run by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations, which is really awesome, and we're really proud of that legacy. So your support is really personal to us, and it's really appreciated by us. I work in the basement of the bookstore in Naperville, and so I don't get to see customers as much, but whenever we get feedback and we get people signing up and we hear how much you love hearing these authors on screen, it really there may be some dancing every once in a while, just to let you know. So normally we would be having this event in person with over 400 a year that we would normally do in before times, as we say, but we're hoping this virtual style keeps us all tied over until we can be together in person again, whenever that may be. We're hoping soon. We have lots of other virtual events on our calendar for all ages and interests. We'd love for you to check them out on our website, which is andersonsbookshop.com, or any of our various social media handles. But tonight, we're very excited to welcome Serena Burdick in conversation with Lauren Willig. Serena's new book is Find Me in Havana, which I very much enjoyed. And Lauren, your new book comes out soon, which is Band of Sisters, right?
Yes, and here we go.
Yes, and they both have previous big, huge best-selling books as well. Girls with No Names, and Lauren, remind me which was like your biggest one,
Oh, my biggest one, gosh.
or your favorite even. Oh, The
Well,
Summer Country, maybe.
favorites always a tough question, but the biggest ones were the Ashford Affair and The Secret History of the Pink Carnation.
Fantastic, which I just, that's the other thing about historical fiction books, is that they have fantastic titles. So anyway, I'm going to get off the screen and let you guys have a conversation. There is a Q&A feature down here. If our attendees have questions for the authors as we go along, go ahead and drop them there. I'll pop on in a little bit, and we can I'll get you some of those questions and we'll go from there. Okay, welcome ladies.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight to celebrate Serena's new book. Sorry, I don't know why I keep saying Meet Me in Havana. Find Me in Havana. I wish we were in Havana. Um, so I have to confess, before I read this, or before we discussed this book on the phone, I had never heard of Estelita Rodriguez. And it's just one of these insane lives that reads like a Danielle Steele novel, except it's all real. So how did you find her? What drew you to her?
Yeah, so I met her daughter, Nina Lopez, about 20 years ago through my mom. So Nina Lopez married a childhood friend of my mother's. So many years ago when I lived in Los Angeles, my mom came to visit me and we took a trip up the coast and we went to visit her old friend. And Nina just started telling her mother's story to my mom and I over breakfast. And she came up from the basement and she had like newspaper clippings and articles. And I was living in LA and I was pursuing an acting career. And the story that she was telling just unfolded it was an incredible story. And it was hard to believe that it had happened to one woman in one lifetime. It was just like everything was an amazing, element for storytelling with this true tale. So at the time, I was so taken with it that I went back to LA, and my mom and I actually researched her together. And this was honestly the old fashioned days where you just didn't Google things. So we went to libraries and we sort of unearthed whatever we could. And we wrote a screenplay that just got like shut. It was like a whim. I didn't even know what to do with a screenplay. So that was it. We wrote it, never thought about it before. So fast forward to all these years later, it had always been in the back of my mind as a story I wanted to write. So I went back to LA. I re-interviewed Nina with a tape recorder in a much more formal way, like digging for questions and getting as much as I could from her.
So did the stories match up? Had they changed over time? Was what she told you all those years ago any different from the version you got this last time?
No, it was exactly the same story. Yeah, it was the same. The only thing that had changed, which was really interesting, but I feel like if I say something, I'm going to be giving it away. The ending. She was. I don't think this is. You can look this up, so it's not any mystery. Nina was very convinced her mother was murdered. She was there when her mother died. So 20 years ago, she was completely convinced that her ex-husband, who she was divorcing, who was violent, who had tried to actually drown her in a pool, killed her. But 20 years later, in her mind, she had started wondering whether it was this other female doctor that Estelita was living with. She was like, maybe she killed her because Estelita was leaving her. So that like had come up over the years for her, that like this questionable, because she was very convinced it was the original husband. And so that was the only thing. And so in the writing of it, I am also completely convinced that Estelita was killed.
And I mean, I guess I shouldn't ask if you have theories about which one did it. I mean, it's this amazing unsolved murder mystery.
No, I really do think it was the man she was divorcing, just because he had every track record for extreme violence with her, had tried to kill her before. So that seems like a no-brainer to me that she had finally left him and was actively seeking a divorce, and then died of like so. According to Nina, Estelita was completely healthy. Nothing was wrong with her. She'd gone to rehearsal. She was, fine. And hours after coming home, she finds her on the bathroom floor, and she kept repeating, "I've been given something. I've been given something." And then she dies very quickly. And then the thing that was so upsetting is her husband, because they were technically still married, could make the decision whether to do an autopsy or not. And of course, he said no, did not want an autopsy done. So that was it, done. Buried her. And
I mean, I feel like if this were a BBC murder mystery, of which I watch way too many, now your book would arouse interest in this, and someone would exhume after all these years, and suddenly it would be one of those rediscovered cold cases. But but one thing that really stood out to me when I was reading the book was the theme of violence against women. That, here's this woman who, not to give, this doesn't give anything away, but here's this woman who is a force in her own right. She's a Hollywood star, but she's constantly at the mercy of the men in her life. When you were writing this, do you think, was this something about the time period? Was it something about just Estelita's life? Was it just bad luck? What was your theory about all this?
yeah, so she did have, it is interesting because I also had to condense a lifetime, right? So from 15 all the way to 37 when she dies is condensed into this time. So the time that I am writing about is kind of the violent time with men in her life. But like her first husband, Chuchu Martinez, who is a real famous Mexican singer, was not violent with her at all. I don't think that the relationship was great, and she leaves him, and then he does absolutely kidnap his daughter from her, and she goes and takes him back. But that relationship was, not a violent one. And her second two husbands actually were not violent to her either. One, Grant Withers, who is a famous movie star, was really a good husband, according to Nina. But he was a alcoholic and severely depressed and had been in the war and was having like tons of issues and ends up, committing suicide. So tragic. And then she's with this other husband who is also not violent, but ends up abusing her daughter. So like not necessarily, but tons of very disturbed men in her life. All of them on some level had, of all four husbands, like everyone had some like very disturbing qualities. And then Cuba with, rebel soldiers and war is inevitably violence. And
I mean, that's a whole topic in and of itself. The way this is, in addition to being someone's life story, you also do a deep dive into Cuban politics. Was it very hard to filter that in, and keep everything straight?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. It wasn't, what the most difficult thing about the Cuban history was that I had to go back because Estelita's childhood, the biggest thing that happened to her in her childhood was the Cuban Revolution of 1933, which is before Castro took over. So I don't think a lot of people think about that revolution nearly as much as they think about the one where Castro took over, or it's not talked about as much. So going into that that took a lot of research to get that right, to get all those facts right, to understand why she would have been rich and then was poor. Because I knew the facts, but I didn't really, but even Nina, her daughter, she didn't know, what exactly like went on there. So I tried to filter the information. I tried to give the information to the reader through the characters. So like as we would talk about politics now that's happening around us, it's not in a very deep or heady way. We just talk about like, the actions that took place. So I tried to give the historical context to the reader like through the voices of the characters, which are not necessarily very deep or complex. They're just
Mhm.
going through it. And then, yeah, with the Castro Revolution, I also have to do quite a bit of research and figure out getting the years right, the time periods, because Nina knew she was there right at this time when he took over. So I had to like getting that time right was always
Oh my
tricky.
gosh, that must have been so tricky triangulating between what she was saying and what you're reading in the books and trying to match them up and figure out how the pieces fit together.
Yeah, and in someone's memory is not accurate all the time. And I would find like Nina was convinced she was 11, but she also knows the year she was born, which would definitely have made her 13 if Castro was taking over. He took over in 1959. So I was
So
like,
how did you reconcile that? How do you do that, without upsetting her?
she is so incredibly like the most gracious woman you could have wanted to write one's life about. Like I actually was completely surprised at how open, emotionally intelligent, willing to just like read this difficult stuff about herself and give over everything she was. Like I could not have asked for um, anything
I
better.
was going to ask you whether it was scary writing about a living person because you do a dual timeline story for the people who haven't read yet. You go back and forth between Nina's viewpoint and Estelita's, and of course, Estelita, dead characters feel safe somehow. You don't have to worry quite so much about maligning them, although of course you still do. But it's harder with a live character who can read what you're writing and say, well, actually, that happened when I was 13, not when I was 11, or vice versa. So, I mean, did you ever feel like she was looking over your shoulder and nervous at all about taking liberties with her internal monologue?
At first, I was for sure, and the only way I could sort of get past that was to really. I mean, it is fiction, so I had facts, but what I didn't have, like, I wouldn't know, what people said to each other, or where they actually went, or how anyone actually felt at a certain time in a certain experience. So all of those things had to be imagined. So I really tried to just set aside the fact that it was a real story and pretended I was writing fiction. So I could really get in the heads of the characters and just completely make them my own, which you just have to do for your characters. And I just decided to not think about it until it was all said and done, and wrote it as I would have written it if no one was going to be questioning it. And then I will admit that when I had to, I agreed to send her, the first draft. Um, my editor was very gracious. She printed a copy. She's like, let's make sure she's okay with everything. And I was so nervous. I was just like, for like a week straight, I was really nervous because there's some really difficult stuff in this. And I
Oh,
know,
it's so personal. I mean, the stuff that she went through as well as her mother. I mean, it's a really raw and emotional and so personal.
so personal, yeah. And I was absolutely nervous about it. And I think like halfway through the book, she emailed me and she was like, oh, I just got to this chapter and I had to put the book down because I was in tears, but it's so good. And I just remember like everything was like, oh, thank God.
So did she feel like she was reading about her own life, or did she feel like she was reading about a fictional character? Did she say?
No, I think she did tell me. She's like, you really got this right, like emotional stuff and things that she went through. And then the only really interesting thing was in real life, Nina was kidnapped when she was 1 years old. Her father kidnapped her to Mexico. But in terms
Mhm.
of creating like a story that made sense in a timeline, I had to make her 12. Like I just couldn't. There would be no relationship. It would have just that was the only major change in the book was that age difference. So that the real fictional part of the book is her at 12 in Cuba. I mean,
Mm.
sorry, in Mexico City. It's the first sort of half of the book when she's kidnapped by her father and goes to Mexico. That is all fiction because other than Estelita really did sneak a costume from the studios, go to Mexico and steal her daughter back and get her over the border. And it was all in the papers. Like you could go look up old Hollywood stories. They were like real life Hollywood story. And it was so that happened. It just didn't happen when Nina was 12. So she said when I interviewed with her last week, we did an interview together. She hadn't told me before that she loved that part because she got to be with her mom. And it was like made me so happy.
Oh,
I thought she would just feel weird about it because it didn't really happen. But she was like,
mhm.
oh, it was so beautiful because I actually got to be with my mom then and go through that with her.
Oh
And
my goodness.
I know.
Wow.
So that was great. So she couldn't have been lovelier about from beginning to end with this thing. Like she was an angel.
Oh my goodness. And that brings up the question of when you're dealing with a real person's life, how do you decide how to slice and dice it? Where to begin, where to end? Well, in this case, the ending was rather,
Yeah.
but and in this case, the layering of the daughter's story and the mother's, what made you make those choices?
Yeah, I had only planned to tell me Estelina's story. Nina wasn't. She was. I can't even remember why I decided to do her voice and
Mhm.
her mom's. I think it came from the fact that I had her in my head. All of the interview tapes were from her perspective. It seemed just a very natural progression to take her perspective and have that into the story. I also just felt like it was really rich because I do think what the book is about is a mother and daughter trying to have this relationship. Because the facts of Estelita's life are all very interesting, but without some sort of emotional drive, the story would fall flat. So I had to find like, well, what is this about? And it's about a life of a mother and daughter that they could never really have a life together that they wanted. So it was a kind of this tragic story, but really needed to be told from Nina's point of view as well.
Tragic, but ultimately redemptive.
Yes, and ultimately redemptive because Nina grew up to be this like incredible woman that had a loving relationship, and I feel like she was like the heroine of the story in the end because Estelina, and it's just a lot of difficult stuff, and so I also didn't want to end it on this tragic death. I needed there to be, so I needed so her life that went on afterwards that the book also isn't about, made it in there just so you could know enough that she went on to have this.
Well, and she provides such an anchoring presence because Estelita's life is so over the top and larger than life and, almost unbelievable. And then Nina is so normal despite all that she lived through. And it provides such a wonderful balance and contrast.
Yeah, and if you meet her now, she is an incredibly just down to earth. But it's fun too because she is incredibly vivacious and energetic, and you can see the sort of spark of her mom in her just when she talks and the way that she engages. So that's like a fun bit. But yeah, I feel like the story too, it's a struggle for, you know, to loop back to Estelina's relationship with men.
Hmm.
I think that ultimately she was trying to have a career and she was ultimately a single mom. And I know that a lot of people are sort of, some people get upset with Estelina in this book. Like they don't love her. They feel frustrated with the decisions that she made. And
Hmm.
do I think wish that she would make a better parenting decision or not send her kid to boarding school or but then you think about the fact that she was this woman trying to have a career, had a career, a great career.
And had to push back to have that career. I mean, I know you say Choo Choo wasn't abusive and all that, but all of the bits in the book, not, again, I don't think this is a spoiler when he's like, no, no, now that we're married, you don't sing anymore. I
That's
mean, that is in its own way, I think, a form of emotional abuse and certainly speaks to what women faced in trying to go out there and have their own identity and have their own career.
yeah, absolutely. She had to leave to do her own thing. And yeah, she got and just women in that era just to be on your own in any capacity and to have a career and a child in any capacity was a huge struggle. It's still a struggle for her.
Do you think, having her mother there with her was what made it possible? I mean, as you speak about sort of the relationships of mothers and daughters, the relationship with her mother is such a strong one and such a guiding something. Sorry, brain's gone. But just it's such a pillar of the book.
Yeah, I love the relationship that Estelita had with her mom. I actually love hearing Nina describe her grandmother because she has a love hate thing with her grandmother. Um, her grandmother was just this very large matriarch who controlled everything. So Nina always felt controlled by her grandmother, and that I think she blamed a lot of the decisions that Estelita made for her. She blamed on her grandmother, and I think that the grandmother was this fascinating woman who could see exactly what it was going to take for Estelita to succeed and exactly where she needed to make her sacrifices. So the choice, like boarding school, was absolutely, according to Nina, like pushed by the grandmother who understood that you won't do this unless we. So she was her, and it is a fascinating thing because there were 7 kids, but she only goes with Estelita.
I was thinking about that in the book when she leaves Cuba and leaves her other daughters who have also suffered traumatic experiences behind. What was it, because there's a special bond between the grandmother and Estelita, or what was it?
Yeah, that's one of those things you just don't know. You have to make up. But it's like Nina didn't know. I mean, I think my guess, what I sort of, hear in the book was that she was very committed to Estelita's career. It was as important to her as it was to Estelita. And because Estelita was the one on this track to stardom, her mom wanted to go with her. And it's true. And I mean, she came here when she was 15, so you wouldn't have come alone. And it is fascinating that she stayed, and it's also fascinating that she lived with Estelita through every single marriage. She lived with them until the last one, the doctor. She like finally moved out, but she lived with her. And I mean, that was not maybe that abnormal back then to like live with your parents and have more of a. And I think culturally it was more normal to live with family.
No, that's true. I think so, that there were more of these multi-generational households, but wow, talk about an extra presence in the house. But so that is fascinating that she left her other children behind like that.
Yeah, and they were quite talented. They were one of her daughters was a really good singer, sang in Cuba. Eventually, they all kind of came over here after the revolution. Her sons were there as well. And I know it's really interesting. She never really even went back. And her husband and her never got. They were. He would.
So he stayed with the other kids?
He stayed in Cuba, but he was Batista's chief of police, which was a huge position for him to have, which was why they were all put in house arrest when they went back to Cuba. When Castro was coming, and he was killed, as were the sons were not. He definitely was.
Well, that was one of the things when I was reading the book, I wondered about, because I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but Che Guevara personally, assaults Estelita. Did that really happen? I mean, it's like seeing the dark side of Evita.
I know. So Che was absolutely there with the other soldiers. So you have to remember, this was told through Nina's perspective, and she was a child. The scene, the really troubling scene, did absolutely happen, and exactly like that. She puts the coat on, she comes in, like it's how Nina tells the story, and her grandmother crying, and so that whole scene is as realistic as it can be. And in terms of the soldier, so Che would come and go with the other soldiers, and so the scene between
he was really there. Wow,
he was really there. The scene between he and Estelita is fictional. That one scene between them where he likes her.
Yeah.
That was fictional, but what he did to her cousin, according to Nina, was not fictional. And the soldiers would come over for dinner, and like the women were supposed to cook for them, and they would listen to the radio, and they were in the barracks across the street. And Nina wasn't super clear on what happened, but they definitely take the women off. So one could only imagine they're rebel soldiers during war. They're not, and these women are in house arrest. They're captured.
Yeah, I mean, you provided a incredibly moving vision of what it's like to live through a revolution and sort of be a woman and powerless despite being an international star.
Yeah, and it is her fame that got them out. And I do also think it was her fame why they were not actually harmed, because Castro was really into the public eye, and also at that time really wanted the U.S. behind him. So we would never have done anything to. He was very careful with how he treated her. He knew that she was there, and I think that they were there for 5 or 6 months, and it was the studios that got her out, that paid
So it was lucky for her family that she was there with them at the time. Okay, but I realize I'm being the worst interviewer ever because I've just been dying to ask you all these specific things, but many people here may not have actually read the book yet. So I should be asking you more general things instead of just being like, oh my God, these were all the things I wanted to know when I was reading this. So researching this book, aside from talking to Nina, how did you go about digging into, there is so much history to cover in this. How did you track it all down?
Yeah, book research was a lot of it.
Mhm.
A lot of old Hollywood at the time, and a lot of the Cuban history, Mexican history. I did travel to Cuba and Mexico, um, which
How was
I'd been to Mexico before, not to Cuba, and so that was great. I was there actually almost this time last year or before December of last year, um, and that was hugely helpful. I could have imagined it, and but just taking the liberty to write the story from the Cuban perspective was, not something that I would have done if I didn't have Nina, wanting me to tell it and there to guide me
Mhm.
through the cultural sort of stuff that we were speaking there. But also just going there and immersing myself in the culture really helped with.
So were you able to find the landmarks in the book? I mean, was there a house still there or had it been built over?
So the house I could not find only because Nina had no idea where the house was, but the town that she grew up in, I did go out to the town. So the town square, it's a pretty small town. And then that was all there. And actually, it was kind of a funny story. When we arrived, it happened to be I just went out for like an afternoon there and back from Havana. It was a 2-hour drive, maybe. Um, there was some incredible festival going on. The streets were just packed with people. And they actually had these like huge flags with Che Guevara's face on them. They were like marching down the street.
Given what you were writing about, oh my God.
No, and it was a huge where they were just dressed up, and it was just this gorgeous music. It was just a really fun thing to land in. And even the taxi driver that had taken me out there was like, "Oh, it's the I can't remember what he said, festival of the town," which is
Oh my gosh, of all the luck to stumble into that.
so that was fun, and I could see the town, and then that actually really did help me describing when they arrive in the town. The house I just made up. I don't even have any idea where it was. Um,
I know that's so frustrating when you feel like you should be able to find something and you dig and that information just doesn't exist.
Not out there, yeah. Yeah. I mean, all of her siblings have passed away. So
Okay, so did you have any, so there was no one else who had been there and lived through it that you were able to triangulate with?
no, I kind of wanted to reach out to cousins of Nina's, but they didn't have great relationships, or I didn't really know. I didn't really want to broach all those.
I'll just say, I mean, memory is so hard. Were there firsthand accounts from the time or were there?
Well, other than just reading kind of historical books, which those give different accounts of the time. So like a lot of books on the revolution, what people were going through, what the towns went through, the smaller towns, how the soldiers came in, what was happening on the streets.
And then you can sort of slice it, Nina's remembrances and incorporate them into that.
Yeah. And because she was in house arrest, and because most of them through the book are, there was
Mhm.
not a lot that actually took place outside of their physical house that I had to write about, other than, the historical facts of understanding what happened. But other than getting to the airport and getting arrested and driving to the house, at that point, then the rest of the book, they're just stuck in their house. And whenever that happens in historical fiction, I'm like, oh, great. I don't have to go down any of these roads because I just have to focus on this one thing that I have to get right.
Yes, it's like having a stage set if you did those high school theater productions. And of course, you were a real actress, so where you have like that one backdrop and everything happens in that one room.
It works.
Yes, no cumbersome dragging of scenery around.
That's right.
So was this a very different experience from writing The Girl with No Name, The Girls with No Names?
Yes, absolutely. I actually really struggled to write this book because I found it very hard to write something that I wasn't purely making up. It's funny because I was thinking about at this point in the game when the book's out and I haven't it's been written for over a year, and
Mhm.
it seems now I'm like, oh yeah, it wasn't so bad. But you have to like dig back, like no, actually, there's always that point when it's really a challenge. Every book has a challenging point at some point for me. I'm like, oh my god, this is really hard.
Well, it's so funny how after you've written it, there's always that feeling of inevitability, that the story could never have happened any other way, that this is just the way it was. And you forget all of those things you agonized about and overthought and rethought.
Yeah, you do. So, and I do remember there were points where I just really struggled. I really struggled with the timeline and with feeling like understanding the natural arc of the story. That I like, oh, when you're coming up with a whole plot line, you can build it and you can have the suspense and you can get the ending. And but when you have all these facts that you have to sort of fit together in a life and then make it feel like an ending where someone just dies is not a great ending. Like you need something else. So like kind of trying to figure out how to piece all of those things together was a real challenge for me.
Well, it feels like layering her story with Nina's story really gave you that arc and that sense of resolution. Because I have to say, I grew up devouring biographical historical fiction, like all the Jean Plaidy novels, but I find them very hard to read now because they are very much like person is born, person lives, stuff happens, person dies. And some of them fascinating things happen, but it's still, there is that sense, there are always points in the narrative where you feel like you're just killing time because
Yeah,
there's things that happen to the person, but don't necessarily move a narrative arc forward, but they're there.
right. And one of the things I struggled with was it didn't really make a lot of sense to have a whole lot of Hollywood in the book. Like ironically, she is a Hollywood star, but her life, the I have a few scenes of it and I touch on it and she goes to me, but that was not what the point of the story was for me to tell it. It wasn't the interesting things that happened to her were not on set or in, she made a movie. I have no facts about how that went for her. I don't even know. Neither did Nina. So like the things that I had were these deep family relationships and like what happened behind the scenes in her life.
It's
Not
like you were doing the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead bit. We're seeing everything that's behind the scenes going on, not the glitz and glamour on the stage. You did sort of the reverse Danielle Steele.
That's right. And I think maybe people expect more Hollywood. I think if my mom read it, she was like, "Oh, there's not a lot of Hollywood in here." I did the best I could.
Like everyone's a critic, but you can't fit everything in. There's no room for it. Also, it just wouldn't have fit the tone of the book at all because I mean, it really felt like this was much more, about the relationships, but also about very much about sort of the Cuban Revolution and the life of an exile. And so there somehow that tonally doesn't work with Hollywood glitz and glamour.
That's right. Yeah, and I kind of also liked how her real life just had Hollywood people in it. Like John Wayne was a really good friend, or she married Grant Withers. And so to sort of wrap that in and make it like a very normal, like I felt like it normalized her Hollywood life.
Makes sense. Like, sort of, after a while, all your best friends become authors. But
Hopes. That'd be great.
yes. But so how, because I know very little about old Hollywood. How famous was she in her time?
I mean, she was a side character. So, and she wasn't like top tier fame.
Mhm.
She did a lot of westerns for Republic Studios, which is not a studio that's in business anymore. She was in John Wayne movies, so he was definitely famous. But being Cuban, she was never the lead, probably never going to be the lead. So she was like the dark heroine or the love interest that distracts the guy from the
Right, the one who gets killed off so he can marry the blonde.
yeah, or
It's like the Ivanhoe problem with Rowena and Rebecca, and Rowena is always gonna get Ivanhoe in the end.
that's right. So those were her, and so she had a career for sure, and she was definitely in that scene and that circle and known. But in terms of like her level of fame, like obviously no one even knows who she is.
Well, that was the thing. I had never, it's funny when you first told me about her, my first assumption was that you had made her up and she was fictional.
Right. Yeah, people do think that. And the sad thing is that in the end, her getting the part as Lupe Velez, and Lupe Velez was a 1930s, 20s, 30s,
Hmm.
whose story is insane. She's got a really, again, like a crazy, outrageous story. And so Estelita was cast to play her, which was going to be huge because and it was a lead. It was a lead role. Like it was all about
Actual lead.
it was an actual lead and it was a great part. And she did get cast and that was going to be like her big thing. And she died before she could do that. So that's another
Well, might be some
tragic.
tragic things. I know. I'm dying to know if she was really killed off or not.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that I don't know what else she would have done. How do you just, like Nina's story, how do you come home from rehearsal and you're completely fine, and 4 hours later, 5, 6 hours later, you're dead with no
Yeah.
explanation? And Nina, like the fact that she kept repeating over and over in Nina's arms, like, someone, I was given something, I was given something.
I feel like, we need Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot. It's sort of, we're so used to our mysteries being tied up in a nice bow, and the villain always gets brought to justice in the end. It's so disappointing when they don't.
Well, the thing, actually, the other odd thing was her husband at the time, who she was currently seeking a divorce from, died a year later of a brain tumor. So
Oh, so erratic behavior.
the fact that he turned really violent and became very erratic and kind of crazy, and because she was with him for 6 years, and I do think the violence started at like the end of that.
Oh, interesting. I mean, that's like the theories about, Henry VIII suddenly going gaga because he got hit in the head at a tournament. And, but similar ideas when someone has such a personality change
That's
and
right.
suddenly acts in these insane ways.
So those facts to me, the fact that he had a brain tumor, that he died of a year later, that he was completely irrational. I mean, I just do think he killed her. It just seems extremely logical to me.
So you're letting the woman who was in love with her off the hook in this one.
That one doesn't make so much sense to me. Like, that's a much further stretch. Also, the fact that her husband chose not to have an autopsy. Why would you do that, in my personal opinion? If there was
If there's any doubt, yeah.
yeah, especially if she wasn't sick and it wasn't a clear cut case, like, of course you would have an autopsy done, unless of course you killed her, and he was a doctor, so he could easily have gotten poison to give her.
That was something I was thinking about was, there's that old line, poison is a woman's weapon, because we assume that male murders are somehow more testosterone driven and violent, but he's a doctor. I mean, he has access to these things.
I've completely concluded that is what happened.
And who knows, maybe someday the truth will out.
Yeah, I don't know if it ever could, but
So as you mentioned, there's always what I call author lag. There's that year between when you finish the book and the book comes out. What have you been working on in the meantime? What's up next for you?
so I actually had kind of a crazy story where I have a novel that was the first book I ever wrote. Started it in college, and the novel has seen so many lives. It is ridiculous. But I did that. I sold it to my publishing house. That will be out summer 2022.
Oh, congratulations. What is that one about?
So that one is about, it is a contemporary story about a young woman who is searching for her father, who she's never met. And in the searching, starts to dig up this past that she's convinced she's related to, but doesn't really have any proof yet. And the past is a woman who is the wife of a famous author in England. And the wife is a poet. So the author's published, so there's things written about them, they're known. It's kind of like a not a super famous English author, like a Wilkie Collins, not a Dickens or something.
Mm-hmm.
So as she's unearthing this story, trying to find her father, simultaneously, the woman's name is Evelyn. Her story is being told to you. So it's a back and forth.
So it's another dual timeline.
Yes. This one is different, though, than anything I've done, because most things I've done sort of take place at the same time, or these are like just completely two different stories unfolding at the same time.
Are the two stories, are they contemporary, or is it you're back in the other woman's past and in your heroine's present?
So the one story is contemporary. It's 2006. And then the other story of her, it would be her great great grandmother, is England in 1900.
Oh, how marvelous.
So you're seeing, and she's telling, the historical piece is told through a journal that is lost, and they are trying to find it. So she's telling her, the whole thing is, you find out in the very beginning of the book that this woman disappears and no one ever knows what happens to her. It's just she vanishes. And there's all sorts of speculation about what happens to her, but no one really knows for sure. So she's telling you her story through her journal.
Right, as you're sort of racing, because through the contemporary character, that this woman disappeared, so you are racing to find out through her journal what actually happened to her. I love that sort of thing.
Yeah, hopefully that's what you're racing to do. Cool.
I love it. It's what I call a puzzle box book, where they're not mysteries per se, but the way they're constructed, because you have the past and the present, and the reader has to try to figure out how the two link up. And they're constructing this little puzzle box as they read it until all the pieces slot together and you finally have that picture. And I love the way it engages your brain when you read it.
Oh yeah, it's funny you should say that because I don't write mysteries, but as I'm writing this, going back and rewriting it again,
Mhm.
it really is. There's a lot of mystery elements to it. Like if she goes to England and she discovers something, and then that leads you to like hints of maybe, and then this thing. And so I was like, oh, this is kind of like unfolding like a real mystery.
It's always funny, like how other people perceive your work versus the way you do. Because when my first book came out, I totally did not think it was a mystery. And then all these mystery bookstore owners started adopting me and being like, we love your mysteries. I was like, I guess I wrote a mystery. Wow, who knew? But it's funny the way, your brain works, that you think you're doing one thing. In fact, half the time you're doing something entirely different.
It is funny. It's also, I think, a funny thing with historical fiction because people, it's
Mhm.
a very big category. And someone actually said to me, do you read historical fiction? And my first instinct was to say no. Like, but wait, I just read, for instance, I read like Homegoing, which, yeah, of course that's historical fiction. Or I was almost, and I was reading a book that took place in like the 1970s. I was like, oh, I guess that is
Well,
also,
that is now, although I find that, it's a little unsettling where it starts to brush up against when you were alive.
you know, is the 80s historical fiction yet? That's coming.
Actually, I was on a historical fiction panel for a book festival this past year. It went virtual, and there was this adorable 20-something author who had written a piece of historical fiction set in the 1980s. And for her, it was genuinely historical. I mean, she was born in like 1995. Oh my God, I felt so ancient. I sort of hid my puffy paint sweatshirt behind me as I listened to her. But
I
yeah, but
honestly waiting for the 90s because I was a teenager in the 90s and I'm like, that's going to be a great time to like resurrect as historical at some point.
well, it cracked me up because when I have a sister who's 12 years younger, and when I was in college in the mid 90s, we had a retro 80s dance. By the time my sister got to the same college 12 years later, they had a retro 90s dance. Like, great, I'm retro now. But it's what you were saying about there are so many types of historical fiction really struck me, because I've seen so many arguments recently about what constitutes real historical fiction versus what doesn't.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, many books I read I almost never read something that takes place in the year like 2015. Like everything is some sort of an element of past to it. Anyway, and it's just funny because I never, before someone asked me if I read historical fiction, I'd never even thought about what I read or what category it fell into.
Well, I mean, which speaks well to just seeking out the things you enjoy. But so, what are you reading right now? What's catching your attention?
Well, I just got the your book, and I'm finishing the Vanishing Half, and
Oh,
I will say this is really good. I'm like the first chapter. I've just started it, but it's totally gripping, and I'm really excited. And this is epic. This is a big novel. Keep doing that. The Vanishing Half, I'm really loving. I'm in the middle of that, and I just picked up Normal People as well.
oh, I've heard such amazing things about that.
We also have. I'm excited because I have some ARCs of the Lost Apothecary, Sarah Penner's book that I'm excited to read, and the Chanel Sisters just arrived on my table. I'm gonna read that one too, which is little. So I have piles of books going.
I know that's always the hardest. It's like, all of those memes about sort of like, I need these 10 books, and then you don't read any of them because once you've bought them, they're no longer exciting.
Yeah, I know. Or like the pile just is here, and then which pile do you start?
Oh my gosh. And I always feel the worst with arcs, because sometimes, they'll get buried. And then 2 years later, I'll be cleaning out a pile next to my desk and I'll find these dusty arcs I absolutely meant to read. And I will feel so guilty.
Uh,
Oh goodness, but it's 8:45 already. So are there questions from people other than me we should be taking?
Yeah, sure. We do have one. Catherine asked, when writing historical fiction, what type of sources do you tend to turn to for your research? when unless you have the actual living person like Serena did, which is amazing.
That is very rare. Doesn't really happen. I mean, Lauren, I books are my go-to. One of the things that I love to do is read fiction that's written in the era that I'm writing about, because fiction just has the level of detail that like books of historical context does not. You know, read a book like a history book, it does not give you like sights, smells, sounds. So I personally love to like seek out some good fiction written in the era I'm trying to write about. That's what I love to do.
I do the same thing because that exact same problem. Historical monographs are great for things like figuring out the political context or, social histories of blah, 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 but they don't tell you what kind of chair your heroine would have sat on or what, the room would have smelled like. What I also really love are contemporary letters, not so much memoirs, because memoirs people have a chance to lie, but letters capture things that people notice at the time. Especially fish out of water letters, where someone's just traveling to the place you're writing about. And so you can read about all the things that struck them as strange or interesting or different. And then those are the details you get to cherry pick and use.
That's such a great one. Where do you find the letters?
Well, I have a secret weapon librarian, a really good friend of mine, who, whenever I get really stuck, I will go to her and be like, I need to know something about blah, blah, blah. And she will miraculously find me these sources out of nowhere. So when I was writing the book before Band of Sisters, The Summer Country, which is set in Barbados in the 1850s, it was really hard to find details about some of the things I needed. And my 1850s heroine, it was dual timeline. The 1850s heroine was an English woman coming to Barbados for the first time. And my librarian's secret weapon found me a bunch of letters from an English woman in 1854 visiting Barbados for the first time, home to her father. And just like all the stuff she noticed and experienced were the sort of things my heroine would notice and experience. It was amazing. So make friends with make friends with lots of librarians. They're amazing. And it's incredible what they can unearth.
Absolutely. So I would add a follow up on that, Serena, when you talk about, and Lauren, you said this too, is reading other historical fiction set in that era. There's kind of a large amount of trust then that you're placing in the author of that book, right? That
Oh,
they are
no.
getting those details right.
Oh, no, not historical fiction by our contemporaries, but fiction written in that era. So like when I was
Oh,
researching,
got it.
yes, I did a book set in London in 1848. So I read Gaskell and the Brontes and anything written
Okay. I
before.
apologize, I misunderstood,
Yeah,
but that's a good clarification too.
The Girls with No Names, I read like a ton of Edith Wharton, and then I wrote my very first novel took place in Paris, so I would seek out like Victor Hugo. So yeah, reading actual people writing in the time that you are wanting to write.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, because that's one of the worst things about being a historical fiction author is it's very hard to read other people's historical fiction, especially in time periods you know something about, because you're
Right.
constantly second guessing everything. And I mean, a lot of it is, do they pass the smell test? I know that sounds horrible, but like, do they break your trust within the first couple of chapters? Because then if that trust is broken, I find myself double checking or overthinking every detail. But if they don't break my trust, I can happily read it.
That's a good one.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So Catherine had a second part of her question that I wanted to kind of split up a little bit too, is about your daily writing schedules. Do you follow a daily routine when you're writing a book, or do you have more of a flexible schedule? What does your inspiration look like?
Well, Lauren, I know you have children as well, and when I'm asked this question, I feel like people with children and people without children have very different answers.
Yes.
Oh, hell yes.
Absolutely have a writing routine if I could. But the reality is that I just kind of scramble to write whenever I can. When they go to school, I'm like, oh, quick, I have 5 hours. Or the weekends, like, if I can, my husband's not busy and like, I need all day Saturday. So you take the kids. And then um, I think that there's very little time that I do not write. I have to make a huge effort to say, like, over the holidays, I was like, okay, 1 week, I'm putting my computer away. And I promise that I won't take it out because I will just sit at the dining room table. And they're all around me. I'm like, shush, stop it. I'm working to go. And that might be like 6 o'clock at night or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm all over the place. I write whenever I can, wherever I can.
That's something I miss about life before kids, was being able to write at all times and write through holidays, and just that line catches you and you run to write it down. But of course, bless you.
Sorry.
But yeah, it's exactly what Serena was saying. Mine are right now, they're 3 and 7. And before the pandemic, my older one was in a 3-hour day preschool. And so I would drop her off, run to the nearest Starbucks, write for my 2 hours and 45 minutes, and then run to be the last mom at the very end of the line. And it really, but two of my two good friends, Beatrice Williams and Karen White, and I have this hashtag male author, that we use to describe sort of authors who get to write with uninterrupted writing time with no one shouting, mommy, mommy, mommy. Because
I love it.
we watch male authors sort of write unencumbered by the children we know they have. It's like, how do you do that? Oh, right, you have a wife.
Mhm. Absolutely. So another question I have for the two of you is, because I had, and again, this is one of those, I think these had just come across my pile at different times, but I've read several books now that were about Cuba and the revolution and, historical fiction about that. It just happened to come that way. Are there, for a long time, and I would argue we're not even quite out of it yet, but like the Tudor era was everything. Everybody was writing. Everybody wanted to be Philip Gregory, right?
It was the other Boleyn girl, second cousin twice removed.
Yes. And I read everyone. I ate them all up. I will freely admit. But there's been a lot of World War II, lately. So are there other trends that you see with amongst your other writers or topics of interest to you guys?
The World War II one is amazing to me. It just keeps going.
It's still going strong.
It's just an endless, and I personally don't have any desire to jump in there. I'm good. I'll let everyone else write about that.
Right.
My theory about it is, I also have no desire to write about it because I find World War II really depressing. But my theory about it is that right now we are longing for stories about good versus evil, where evil is crushed. We don't want nuance. We don't want witty banter. We want to see, plucky people outwit the Nazis. And we know in the end it's safe because we know in the end the Allies win.
Mm.
And that's the sort of reassurance people have needed over the last tumultuous however long.
Right.
But I have
Right.
a theory about sort of synergy between different time periods. Like when we were growing up, because we're basically the same age, it was all Victoriana and Gothics, and something about like the big hair of the 80s synced with the hoop skirts.
Mm.
And then in the 2000s,
The big collars, right? The big lace
Exactly.
Victorian collars. Yeah.
Everything was big and dramatic and bold, and somehow that worked together. And like in the early thousands, it was all Jane Austen spin-offs and remakes and Regency Land and chick lit, and that all worked. And now we're in this sort of apocalyptic time of good versus evil in World War II. And I really hope it goes somewhere interesting from there.
I was going to say, what do you guys think is next then?
I don't know. I find that I never really thought. So first of all, I never thought of myself as a historical fiction author. I never thought of, like my reading, I read whatever. I also think that I'll write whatever. So I never thought that I would never plan to write about a specific time and stick to that. I like to jump all over the place. So, my first book is Paris in the 1870s. My next one was New York City 1910, just because for me, I find something I'm intrigued with. And it's not necessarily the time period. It's like for that book, it was the House of Mercy. And then it just happened to be that that's the time that it was in. And then this one happened to be the story, and it was the 50s, 40s to 50s. So I don't, yeah. And the one I'm writing now is contemporary and turn of the century, 1900, turn of the century. So for me, more, it's becoming intrigued with like either a person or an event, and it could be in any time period. It's an interesting thing.
I like how you have to say turn of the century means 1900 now.
Not that century.
Oh, that makes me feel old. I know my daughter looked at me. My daughter's 7. She looks at me today and goes, "Mom, you are so 20th century." I was like, oh my God, that was an insult, wasn't it?
My 8-year-old would say the same thing. Yes. Well, there's that whole thing where like, if to check someone's ID to see if they can purchase alcohol, and oh, I see the one on your birthday year, so you're good, because nobody who was born, and I'm like, oh God,
I feel so old.
I know, it didn't help.
I grew
Anyway.
up.
So that's, yeah. So you hop around a lot, Serena, which I think.
I will. I never.
Yeah.
Really, But I do understand that idea that your readers sort of, when you have a fan base, they kind of expect something maybe similar, or something they're looking for, something like the last thing you wrote. And I'm not sure, like this book is very, very different than the one that came out last time. So I have a feeling that will be the writer I am. Everyone should just get prepared for that.
Always be surprised. I think it's great. Well, I think it's interesting too on the World War II angle that, we've lost almost all of the people who lived in that era, right? Or who fought in that war, who were old enough to fought in, to be an adult part of that war somehow. And I think that's part of a little bit too of it, that, the students learning history and American history now or international history now, that's much farther back for them than it was, when we were studying it. So does that shift, do our children have a phase of war, historical fiction about Vietnam, when they're our age? That would be really interesting to see how that goes. I would have to look at, I don't know, the data would really exist, but to see big bestsellers, 40 years ago, and did that reflect a time period, before that? I don't know.
Well, I have a good friend who has a theory that there is a generational cycle and that every 30 years something comes back. And it's funny because I remember reading all of the big World War II blockbusters when I was a preteen, like Herman Wouk and Winds of War and Leon Uris, and they were depressing and dramatic and all of that sort of thing. And then they all went away and now they came back, but they came back with a twist. And so I sort of wonder 30 years from now, do we get another World War II iteration?
Right.
And which part of the 30-year cycle are we on now?
Well, I also do love that the World War II novels that are coming out are all from female stories.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking too. That's the twist, is that the ones I read before were fundamentally male oriented. With some exceptions. There was like Susan Isaac's Shining Through, which was in some ways more similar to the books that are coming out now because it's the intrepid secretary who becomes a spy sort of thing. But these are all about ordinary women who rise to the circumstances in extraordinary times, which again, I think is a measure of what we need reassurance about at the moment.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
like you just write about World War I, which I actually, if anything, would be fascinated to write about that time. I do find that, and I don't think World War I is not a war that people write about as often.
Well, no, but it's less clear. It's less good versus evil. And that's actually one of the things that draws me to it is I like messy history, where you don't necessarily have this sort of good versus evil. You have people making stupid decisions that lead to other stupid decisions, and then they get entangled they never expected, like 4 years of trench warfare. And
right.
Get from Queen Victoria's grandchildren on thrones across Europe calling each other, Nicky and Dicky and whatnot, and to trench warfare and mustard gas. And, what does that do to people? And that's the sort of thing I find really fascinating.
Well, I think as a reader too, for World War I, it's like, that it happened. There was an end. As you say, it was messy, but then that, 20 years later, we're back in it. And really in between those 2 decades in between, there was still some awful things happening that led right down to it. It was almost a pause as opposed to an end and then a start of the second one, right? So I think from a reader's perspective, that's interesting too.
Yeah, that we know. I mean, that's the problem though, when you're writing about these things, is you have to kill the hindsight. And you can only know as far as your characters know. And sometimes that's very hard because you don't want to foreshadow at all.
Right. Well, I don't know if our other participants have any other questions. Those are the ones that we had, which was a great discussion. So thank you for those. But I am going to put in, I can get to my links here. I'm going to put a link to both of these new fantastic books into our chat here so that if you haven't yet purchased your copy, your signed copy, thank you both, by the way. I had signed book plates from you like in December and it just made my day because I didn't have to harass anybody about it. It was wonderful.
You had nothing else to do.
Yeah,
well,
list.
So yes, and Band of Sisters obviously is not out quite yet, but you can still pre-order it from us. Here's that link too, and any other of the books by these fantastic authors. I would like to thank you both for spending time with us tonight. I know that there's a lot to do and you both have kids and I totally get that. But
it totally gave me an excuse to lock myself in my room with a glass of wine. So thank you.
Well, mom to mom to mom, we're here to help each other, right?
I know, the three of us.
Yes.
really excited to when you guys my publicist first said your bookshop. I was like, oh yes, because you're in
Yes.
Chicago, so it makes me feel like I'm a little bit in Chicago.
Right. Yes. Well, I can send some of the pretty snow your way. Hopefully not the random power outages and things and icy roads that we had. But yes, we can pretend we're a little bit, and then I would love to pretend a little bit that I'm on the East Coast as well. So we'll exchange those as well. But thank you to those of us who joined us this evening. We appreciate your time, and again, I know it's more screen time for our eyeballs, but hopefully you got out of it quite a bit as well. And I know you have some great reading ahead of you for those of you that have the books on your to read pile. If it doesn't topple over and smother you beforehand, which is usually what we joke about at the bookstore. Mine has to be several piles in several different places so that people can't see how many I have to read still. But
We're like archaeological layers.
yes, exactly. They're going to find me. They're going to dig me up someday, and I'm going to be just buried under bits of old paper. If you did order a book, will be signed and available for pickup in our Naperville store very soon. We'll send you an email, or if you chose shipping, that'll be available as well. We'll send you an email when that is ready. Because it's just a few of us in the basement getting those out. So thanks for your patience very much. But thank you to our authors. Best of luck to you both. Congratulations on the new book now, Serena, and the new book coming, Lauren. And I can't wait to see what you both have coming up in the future as well.
Great. Thanks so much for having me again.
Of course.
Thank you for having me, Jane. Thank you for letting me be part of your launch, Serena. This was such fun.
Lauren, I so appreciate you being here and reading the book and all the support up until now. So
yay. All right, next time when we can be in person, we'll have you both at the store together. Deal?
Deal. Perfect.
Love it. More historical fiction gossip, and we'll have wine too. All right.
Well, in that case, okay, have a wonderful time in the snow.
Thank you.
Be safe, you guys.
Be safe, everyone. All right, have a good night. Bye-bye.